Okay. There we go. And that works. Alright. So Bella, I do have a book for you. You just need to come get it. But yeah, hopefully Eli and Bella watch this and they can be caught up and not lose any time next week. Alright, any questions on stuff we talked about last week before we jump into the next one? Alright, so tonight's is the last of the kind of overview of the general Bible. We're going to look at the central narrative of what it's all about, and then we'll next week is when we'll start looking at the individual narratives and the individual books, and then just start working our way through. Before we begin, Emily, would you like to recite as many books of the Bible as you can for me? Please.
I'm still trying to learn.
Can you give me as far as you got so far?
I'm trying to pronounce them. It's kind of hard for me.
Okay. YouTube videos help with that, but
yeah.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So we at least heard all of them at least once. So. Okay. All right. Opening exercise. So consider this, the value of a good story. Think about your favorite stories, could be from books, movies, television, etc. Regardless of where they are from, think about what makes them great. Think about things like who the hero is, what the story's about, what the characters learn, or any combination of these. Identify two, and then in the space below, take about 30 seconds to jot down the name of one of your favorite stories and write or draw some details that stick out to you about what makes that story great. So on one of those scrolls, write down a favorite story and a couple of reasons why you like it, what makes it great. Any thoughts?
So my favorite story is Star Wars because there was a plot and a lesson that each character has.
Very generic. Did you just say you like Star Wars because there's a plot?
No,
Oh.
a lesson that the character has.
Okay. Emily?
I like Harry Potter just because I like the plot of it and the comic.
Okay. I'm playing a Harry Potter game on my PlayStation right now. Alright. So then, theoretically, if we were in a larger classroom, we would trade books and then you would write yours down on that second scroll for somebody, but two people, we don't really need to do that. If you want to write down what the other person said on that scroll, you can. But I would just as soon move on. So, pinkish, orange, or whatever color that is, box on the bottom. Stories in God's Word. So the amazing thing that the Bible tells the greatest story of all time about good and evil, wars and struggle, romance and journeys. At the heart of this story is Jesus, the one whom God promised at the beginning of the story of salvation, who came to conquer sin, death, and hell for us, and who has promised to come again. All of it is true. So from here on out, we're going to use the word narrative when we talk about the events of the Bible, because a narrative is a written account of something that happened. I'm probably going to still refer to them as Bible stories just because that's the language I'm used to growing up with. But the point they're trying to make is that when you hear the word story, sometimes we just automatically think that's talking about a fictional account like Star Wars or Harry Potter. And so by using the word narrative, we're trying to emphasize that what is recorded in the Bible actually happened, rather than something make-believe. So the book is going to use the word narrative to try to avoid that confusion. I will try to do so as well, but I use the word story a lot because, quite frankly, to me, story doesn't inherently mean fictional. I talk about, people say, what's your life story? What's your story? How'd you get here? I'm going to tell you a story about what happened to me today. I don't necessarily think it's fictional, but there you go. All right, so open your book so you have both pages available. So this is going to be, again, a big timeline overview, not super detailed, but this will be an overview of the biblical timeline. So, top of 14, the timeline of God's narrative of salvation. The narrative of the Bible is big, long, and epic. It's a narrative of God creating man falling into sin, God promising restoration, and God fulfilling his promises, among many other things. In this lesson, we'll begin to think through the timeline of the events in the big overall narrative. So first we'll look at the timeline in the middle of this page, the earliest narratives in the Bible when they happened, and at the beginning of everything. So, filling in the blanks, that big red arrow on the left with the number 1, label that as the beginning. So some refer to this as the prehistorical part of the Bible because we can't really date exactly when the beginning happens. But that's going to be our first couple of characters we're introduced to. So, the next major narrative of salvation, where we get lots of characters and historical references, really begins around 2000 BC. So next to number 2, label that 2000 BC. And each of these chunks on the timeline are going to be about 500 years. So next to 3, label that 1500 BC. 4 is 1000 BC. Excuse me. On the next page, 5 is 500 BC. Then where it says AD 1, it says draw a star, which is supposed to be the Star of Bethlehem because we're counting that as Jesus' birth. He was actually probably born around 4 BC. They miscalculated that a little bit, but we'll go with 1 AD. It's close enough. This is not a super specific timeline. It's giving us generalities anyway. And at point number 6, label that 33 AD and draw a cross. This is roughly when we're assuming Christ's death and resurrection and ascension into heaven happens, thus ending his earthly ministry. And then in the red arrow on the right, number 7, write the church. This is the age we are in ever since Pentecost, which happens 10 days after Christ's ascension. The church is instituted on Pentecost, and it continues on today. So that's where we are now. Everything clearish so far? All right. So now the next page is going to instruct us how we're going to fill in some of the major players here. So there's tons here, right? Let's keep filling in the narrative of salvation by adding some important names of a bunch of vital people to these landmark dates. This should help us remember the order of the big narratives of salvation and the people involved and roughly when they lived. Again, it's not going to be super precise. So going back to the start at number 1, where you're in the beginning, in the prehistory, in the area where we can't necessarily date it, you're going to write Adam and Eve and Noah. We can't really date those because we don't know entirely how many generations there are between Adam and Eve and Abraham. There are some genealogies in the Bible, but they're not necessarily complete. It's a common thing in the genealogies of that time period to just like give you the highlights of the ancestry and not necessarily list every single name. So we don't really know necessarily how far back it goes. So we don't know exactly when these events happen. But we do have genealogies from Abraham to Moses, and then we can start to date things. So around 2000 BC, put Abraham above the date. So roughly when he lived. And then above 1500 BC, write Moses. Above 1000 BC, write David. Above 500 BC, write Daniel. Then we have the star above AD 1 to represent the Star of Bethlehem and when Jesus is born. Above the 33 AD where you had the cross, you can also write the death and resurrection. And then this part is not how I would label this, but for the age of the church on that right arrow, they want you to write Peter and Paul, although that's a little bit misleading because Peter was there for Jesus' earthly ministry, and Paul comes along shortly after, so it's not like Peter and Paul are still walking around today. But otherwise, yeah. I'm not going to go on that tangent. But yeah, so on the timeline, you can see on the bottom, it gives you various books of the Bible, so you can kind of see on the timeline about when those books are taking place as well. Any questions on what we filled in so far, what all this means yet? Okay. So now, not the best layout, but on the next page they're going to give us more stuff to fill in on this page. Sorry, a lot of flipping back and forth. I didn't design this book, don't blame me. Alright, so the last piece of the puzzle is the last piece of the puzzle is putting in the different chapters or big chunks of the narrative of salvation. So think of your favorite television or book series. Star Wars and Harry Potter work for this just as well too. Well, Harry Potter is a book series, but yeah. One that has the same characters throughout the series. Write down the title below. Then in your own words, write or sketch the plot of what happened from one season or one of the books. Then sketch out the setting of the book and how it adds to the overall story of the series. So for Harry Potter, pick one book out of the Harry Potter series. For Star Wars, pick one of the movies of the 6, because I don't recognize the sequel trilogy. So pick one entry out of the series, and on that left-hand column where it says one season or book, write the title of the one you've picked, and then just a brief description of what happens in that one book or movie. Does that make sense? the title and then a very brief description of what happens within that book. So again, one sentence plot summary.
Is there a water fountain here?
Yes. Or would you rather just have a water bottle?
There's a water fountain.
Okay. Be right back. Keegan, which movie did you pick?
I would say Revenge of the Sith, and it's in Darth Vader, and it's based on Hotham, Hoth, and it's based on producing Rush.
That's Empire Strikes Back.
Oh.
Hmm?
I said it's subject this movie.
Well, Revenge of the Sith is when Anakin becomes Darth Vader. Yeah. Empire Strikes Back is when they have the assault on Hoth and they have to flee. And you find out the big twist. Emily, which book did you pick?
I did the Chamber of Secrets.
Okay, and what happens in that one?
Isn't that where they go into the chamber and they have that?
Yeah, the basilisk.
And
Yep.
then it kills the guy with
Yep. Alright. So now, next step, your show or movie or book series is made up of different seasons or books or episodes. Each season or book or episode is its own story, but they also fit together with the other entries to make up a larger story. So Star Wars isn't just one movie, it's 6, plus a bunch of TV shows of varying quality. Harry Potter is 7 different books, it's not just one book. Again, each book is its own story, but they also fit a grander narrative. So that's how we're thinking about the Bible. And again, going with this issue, how the Bible is 66 different books, and each of them are their own self-contained thing, but they also fit into the greater whole to tell us the larger story of salvation, or the narrative of salvation, as the book would have us say. So the Bible narrative also tells one story of God's plan to send Jesus to restore creation, but it's also made up of different chapters or seasons or episodes, whatever term you want to use. So now we're going to turn back to our timeline and write these names in the different blanks on the timeline of the previous page to again flesh this out and give a visual of how everything fits together. So where you have the letters on the timeline, next to A, write the patriarchs. And do we know what patriarch means? In this case, the patriarch is the patriarchs are the overarching fathers, or the ancestors of it all, the ones who started it all off. So you've heard the song, Father Abraham had many sons, that kind of idea. So Abraham is the first of the patriarchs. So it's Abraham and his immediate descendants, because they're the ancestors for the whole nation of Israel. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons are the patriarchs, because from them come the whole nation of Israel. Next to B, write the slavery in Egypt. Next to C, write the Exodus. So Exodus is really just a fancy word to mean leaving something, or an exit from something. So the Exodus is the story of Israel leaving Egypt. We'll talk about that when we get there. Next to D, write the Judges.
Does the Judges come from the book Judges?
Yeah, well, the book of Judges records the time of the judges.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll talk about when we get there. But basically, when after the Exodus, after the 40 years in the desert, when the Israelites come into the Promised Land, that begins the time of the Judges, which means Israel doesn't have a king. They're all kind of independently led tribes within themselves, but when they do need to unite under a unified leader for whatever reason, God raises up what's called a judge, and they're kind of like a king over Israel in that they rule and they take unified leadership to organize everything, but it's not a hereditary position like a monarchy is. So God just raises up a judge, and they do their thing for the time that they're needed, and then when that judge dies, then they kind of go back to their more tribal system. And so the book of the Judges covers that period of their history. I'm blanking on how long it is, but it's a couple hundred years. Next to E, write the Kings, which is when Israel does become a monarchy, starting with King Solomon and King David. Next to F, write the divided kingdom. Next to G, write the exile and return. Next to H, write the time between the testaments, or you can say the intertestamental period. Next to I, write Jesus' ministry. And next to J, write Jesus' passion and glorification. So these are kind of these subdivisions in the grand narrative of the Bible. You could kind of think of them as chapters or book entries. And these also could be subdivided even more. Like, the patriarchs are the entire book of Genesis. There's 50 chapters there that covers Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his 12 sons, Joseph, them winding up in Egypt.
What's the longest book of the Bible?
I believe Jeremiah.
How many chapters are
I want to say 60 something.
there?
No, 52.
Well,
I mean, the most chapters are going to be in Psalms with 150, but I think in terms of sheer word count, Jeremiah is the longest. So these are the individual stops, but they're all telling one unified story overall, which is what we're getting to in this last section. All right. So now we're going to look up Romans 3:10. So read Romans 3:10 through 11, and what does it tell you about humanity's relationship with God? 3:10 through 11. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. So what does this tell us about humanity's relationship to God? As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. So what does that tell us? Emily, what do you think?
Not everyone understands his relationship with God. It's different.
You're on the right track. Keegan, what do you think?
I don't really know.
So, trying to think how to phrase this. Do you think there's anyone who's not sinful? Oh, okay, yes. That's true. Anyone other, any,
No one's perfect, so.
yeah. So all of humanity, none of us are perfect. All of us are sinful in some degree. All of us have fallen short of God's standard in some way, shape, or form. So no one is perfectly righteous before God. No one has a full understanding of God. No one, by their own volition, is really looking after God. We're, by nature, pretty selfish jerks most of the time. So if you look to that picture of the dude on the cliff, on the yeah, which is the point. So on the left-hand side of the picture, by the man, write sinful people. And on the right-hand side, write holy God. And so this is going back to the first lesson when we were talking about the law, when we were talking about law and gospel, and how one of the functions of the law is that it shows us our sin. It shows us, our sin creates this chasm between us and God. And so because of our sin, we can't just approach the holy God. We're imperfect. And so yeah, this guy just keeps walking. He's going to have a bad time because his sin has created this chasm. He's going to fall into it. He's going to die. It's not going to be very good for him. So as it stands, we've all broken God's law. We're all imperfect. We're all set to tumble down a cliff if we think we can do everything on our own. Now read Galatians 4:4-5, and reflect on what does it tell us about what God chose to do for you. So Galatians 4:4-5 says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." What does that tell us God does for us?
You said he chose to redeem people and forgive them for their sins.
Right. And what does it mean to redeem someone? you're on the right track. We'll talk about it more as we get to Ruth, especially. Yeah, so we're on this cliff. If we keep walking forward, we're going to have a bad time. There is this chasm before us. We can't make it on our own because of our sinfulness. But then Jesus becomes incarnate. He dies for our sin. He pays the penalty for us. He fulfills the law where we cannot, to restore our access to God. He restores that relationship with God, which is what Galatians talks about a lot. So in that picture, between the two sides, draw a cross as a bridge. This is the grand plot of the narrative of the Bible, God's big plan to restore you to himself through Jesus. So it should look like that. So Jesus bridges this gap so that now we have access to the Father. So again, let me take a somewhere through. So that's the grand overarching narrative of the Bible, is getting us to. We'll start with seeing how we fall into sin and recognizing our sinfulness, and then the whole Old Testament is going to be getting us ready for when Jesus arrives, and then the New Testament is going to be telling us about what Jesus did for us and what grows out of it. So again, this is that bow tie illustration that we had from week 1. So everything in the Old Testament is pointing us to Jesus. Everything in the New Testament is pointing back to Jesus and showing what he's done and what's growing out of it. But that, so again, in the different books, you have their own individual narratives, but the big overarching theme that they all plug into and fit into is that resurrection story of Jesus that Jesus does for us for our salvation. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right. So that big overview of the Bible, and then next week we're going to start looking at the individual books and going into more detail on all of those. So, now that we've talked about the big overarching theme of the story, and again, this is the law gospel thing. The law is our recognition of all the sins we've done, why we need forgiveness, and then the gospel shows us how forgiveness is accomplished for us. The law is the things we're supposed to do. The gospel are the things that Jesus has done for us. So, I would like you to start doing sermon outlines when you go to church. So we'll have a stack of these on the table in the narthex. I'll give some to you now too. So I'd like it if you would come here, but if you go to another church, if you could bring that and try to fill those out for the sermon there and bring a bulletin back so I know you went, that would be cool. But yeah, this is to help prepare you to be more engaged in services overall. So have some reflection on the hymns in the service, what scripture the sermon was on, and then the main focus here are on those bottom two parts. The troubles in the world, the sins in the world, the law application in the world, and then also how it talks about Jesus, how the gospel is preached in the sermon as well, and what comfort and encouragement it brings to you. So that's the theme. Those are the themes you should be looking for in any sermon you're hearing preached, and hopefully those elements will be in there. Otherwise, someone's not doing their job correctly. Any questions on that? This was kind of a short lesson, so we're done a little bit early. So if you need to text rides and tell them they can come get you now, that would be cool. Otherwise, I don't really have anything else for you tonight. Next week we'll start at the beginning with the book of Genesis, and then we'll start going through the Bible, looking at the actual individual books. So again, continue working on memorization. Try to do sermon outlines when you go to church. Maybe don't do them this week because I'm reading someone else's sermon and it doesn't necessarily fit this very well. But in the following weeks, when you're in church, yeah, not this week, but following weeks, well, here at least, yeah, the following weeks we come to church and do a sermon outline and then just bring them to me have confirmation in class. Otherwise, you're dismissed. Call in text to let people know they can come pick you up now. Sorry it's a little early, or you're welcome it's a little early. And Bella and Eli, hopefully we'll see you next week.